that the skies were the limit. There was no limit to what one wanted to achieve if he put his mind to it.
My father used to work for Mr. Scott when he was a contractor here on Sabre. And my brother Freddie, when he went to school in St. Maarten, I remember him telling me a story how my mother had written a letter to Mr. Scott to keep an eye on him. He was studying for teacher over there back in the 1940s. And Mr. Scott had a habit on Sunday nights. He would go to pick up his aunt, Miss Zyla, on Back Street, take her to the Methodist Church. And one night my brother was smoking a cigarette there on the back street, and Mr. Scott happened to pass by in his big limousine, and he slammed the brakes and reversed. He said, that wouldn't be Johnson's boy there smoking a cigarette, would it? In the meantime, my brother had thrown his cigarette over the wall, and of course he denied that he had been smoking a cigarette. So when I started working at St. Maarten in 1960 at the post office, I guess my mother must have done the same thing to me, because it was shortly after that Mr. Scott came to the receiver's office, and then he introduced himself to me, and he was telling me all of the different receivers that he had had problems with taxes and so on. So I guess he was sending me a message to be careful with him, because he didn't appreciate these receivers, bother him too much with taxes. But anyway, that was the beginning of a very good relationship, and I must say he was really one of the most respected and admired men of St. Maarten when I lived there, when he was still alive.
In spite of LB wanting the best for his people, it was not always perceived as such, especially since at times he was seen as a disciplinarian.
To be honest with you, I didn't really know my grandfather. I saw him once or twice in church, and I remember going to his funeral, because after reading about him, I realized he was a very busy man. He was very ambitious, very industrious, and in those days you had to work hard to get where you were. And I've spoken to several people. You hear the good and you hear the bad, and I believe in everybody there's a good and bad. And from what I've understood from LB Scott, he feels that as a black man in a world where we can try to deny it as much as possible, the world, in a sense, the white people, they are actually the ones deciding and determining what's really happening. And I think at that time, especially in the time of Garveyism and all of that, you had to be very careful. And if you want your people to really elevate yourself, you had to be sometimes very, very strong.
Though he was a tough and stern man, he wanted what was best for you, albeit in unconventional ways.
Fond memories. I can remember the days when I was explaining to you earlier. My father, as I said, was a disciplinarian. Every time you meet him, if you met him in the road 3 times a day, you had to kiss my father. As a big boy growing up, all my friends would laugh at that, because, they didn't do it to their father, but my father, he had to do it. And up until this day, it made you fear him, but at the same time be fond of him. You realize that he was trying to instill something in you. You had to respect him, you had to fear him, you had to love him, and those are the things that I remember quite clearly.
His desire to contribute to the community and his leadership capability made him want to take the bull by the horns. In 1932, after returning from the Dominican Republic, LB, with the philosophy of self-determination, started the PMIA Hall, a branch of the UNIA, an organization started by Marcus Garvey, a Jamaican national who traveled the world witnessing black oppression, started the United Negro Improvement Association in 1914 to improve the position of blacks through racial pride, community unity, personal improvement and excellence, educational advancement, economic development, national independence, political consciousness, and self-determination.
Well, one of the things that he learned in Santo Domingo, which lived with him throughout his life, was to be the best you can be. And that came through the Garveyite movement, because in the 20s, that was very predominant in those days, because all the people from this side of the Caribbean who went to Santo Domingo, most of them were black, or the majority of them were black. So what happened is Marcus Garvey had a big influence on all those people in those days, and the Garvey movement took hold, and they started the United Negro Improvement Association. After that began, he also became the 26th vice president of the Garvey movement of those days. And with that in hand, because it was a way of, it was Pan-Africanism at its best in those days, what later in the 60s became Black Power. It taught black people that they were better than they felt they were. They had a reason to try and excel and to be the best they could be. And I think that's one of the things that he brought back when he started the PMIA in 1932. You know, most people in those days, they were not accustomed to that type of radicalism. And he had a great following with the PMIA, and lots of people in St. Maarten in those days followed the PMIA's traditions.
LB Scott was one of the founders, and he was the first president of the PMIA, which stands for Phillipsburg Mutual Improvement Association. We've had various discussions as to why he really called it PMIA and not UNIA, because it actually was patterned after UNIA. But after discussing it with different people, he realized he was thinking ahead, because if he was going to focus on only the Negro part of it, you all know St. Maarten is made up of different ethnic people, and by making it Phillipsburg, it made it more general. But his focus was still on promoting leadership among women and men in the area of social, politics, and economics, because he feels as men and women, we should be self-reliant. If you want something, you should work for it. You should do something for it.
As a man well respected in the community, LB was appointed to a highly exclusive body and the first black man to serve on the Council of Policy. According to his son, Don, these men were the wise men of the villages that were running things. Will Johnson shed additional light on the subject?
This goes back to 1865, I think, when it was established. It was the first trend towards democracy or democratization of the islands. The council just consisted of 2 members on each island. They were elected, but elected by people of means. In order to be a voter, you had to have over 500 guilders a year income, or you had to have property of a certain value. So very limited people could vote. There were 2 people that were elected. They were advisors to the governor at the time. They had limited powers, but when it came to the budget, at least they could suggest to put things in the budget and so. But they were generally respected for the authority they had. And there were quite a number of people that served with distinction on that Court of Policy. Well, of course, it came to an end in 1951, July 1951, when the island councils were elected, and Mr. Scott was one of the members on St. Maarten of that Court of Policy. I do not recall at the moment how many years he served, but it was two people, usually men, because the women didn't get voting rights until 1947 or 48, and before that time it was only men that served on that council.
In 1952, LB retired as the head from the Department of Public Works. In 1955, he was number 4 on the NVP, receiving 22 votes, while Claude Watty became the leader of the Democratic Party that won the election at the time. In 1959, LB ran again as the number 1 candidate of the NVP, getting 110 votes. LB was elected as opposition. His last election, in which he headed the NVP, was in 1963. He received 59 votes. LB was also a lover of animals. Besides having his cattle, goats, and dogs, he is most remembered for his love and quality of horses. Claude Cowboy York talks about his fond memories of LB and himself as a boy.
I know him, and he put me to clean his horse. I still couldn't get on it. Until after a long time that he get accustomed to me, he let me walk it off, bring it back, and I'll tie it to the tree. He had some sticky berry trees in the yard there, and tie him there, landash, old landash, and Dutchess. And then after a long time, he let me get on right there with the horse tied there and come off. And then after that he get confidence in me, he'd let me take them out for a ride. I remember breaking in a young stallion. He had a black one. And when they was building the wharf here in 1959, I came down with a horse to bring some food from my father. on the wharf up here in Point Blanche.